Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Accent On podcast. My name is Jay Alexander Polton, and I am your host, otherwise known as the Accent Coach sometimes. And I have with me today Jeff Carroll, who's an executive coach. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Thank you for having me, Jay. This is an honor.
Thank you very much for being here. I normally launch into a big description about who I have on the podcast, but I want to launch in and jump straight into your brain and talk straight away. And I think our talk today is going to mainly center around executive coaching, leadership coaching, personal growth. And that's something I'm very interested in. And I want to start out because we have a similar connection through sport. And you are currently an executive coach, but in your past life, you were a coach. So tell me about that life as a coach and how it has kind of influenced you in your current position as executive coach.
Yeah, well, I suppose we'd have to go all the way back to my childhood to kind of get to that piece. And as I think about where I was and where I am now, I know that everything started for me in the old neighborhood. I grew up next door to a guy who eventually became a professional baseball player, and he was coaching myself and all the little kids in the neighborhood around all the sports. And thanks to him, we all became very good at sports. And for myself, because he was coaching me all the time, his name was Joe McIntosh. I mean, I don't know. I just developed a deep passion to want to become a coach. And so, therefore, and also I had a track coach in high school who I just really admired and had a deep impact on me. And so, that's what I wanted to do. And so starting late in my junior year in college, I started coaching junior high athletics, high school athletics, and then eventually became a head high school volleyball coach for 31 years. And, it was kind of interesting because I felt like I knew I was coming to the end of that career, but I still felt like there was something more. And truly there was. And I'll just call it vocation or a sweet spot in that I really love developing players. But I was really becoming more interested in developing people. And so, and through something called the Townsend Leadership Program, I, got introduced to executive coaching. I had a couple of great mentors. And so I started doing that at the tail end of my teaching career. And that's where I land today. I don't know if that answers your question. I was trying to keep that as short as I could, but that's the story in a nutshell. I mean, I will tell you this straight out, Jay, and that is that I feel like I was born to coach. So I feel like I'm living out my true identity, and and especially now, I really feel like I'm in my sweet spot.
So let's talk a little bit more about sports because I have a
Yeah.
nice history of sports in the hockey realm,
Mhm.
and I've written a bunch of books about sports over the years as well. And so, what is the single most important factor to you that leads to a championship team? I don't know if you've were those 31 years all successful, or were they some success not so successful?
Oh, the first five were a struggle. The first
So
five was
what makes a team gel and
okay.
become a
Well,
championship team?
okay. Yeah. Well, I would say that it really starts at the top. Have to have a competent coach, somebody who knows what he's talking about, and the people that he's leading, believe that he knows what he's talking about. And secondly, character, ability to, deal with the demands of reality. And in my reality, it was a really difficult thing when trying to help volleyball get off the ground here in the state of Montana. That was kind of crazy. But, what I discovered after those first 5 years of my coaching was that, and this is, you'd think that I would have picked up on this axiom earlier, but you cannot divorce leadership from relationship. And once I started to really hone in to that truth and develop relationships with my players, really get to know them on a deeper level and not just as volleyball players, but as people first. the rest was history. I mean, so over the last, I don't know, however many years of my career, we went to the state championship 18 times. We won 12 of those, and then we also finished third on four other occasions. And so, going back to your question, were all of those years successful? And I would say the last part, yes, but only when I decided that I needed to become a better leader. I had to get more competent. I had to develop my character and the capacity to be able to really connect with my players with where they were, not with where I was.
So it sounds like there's a direct correlation to what you do now, speaking to executive leaders who have that same
Mhm.
kind of, or who need that same kind of mentality to lead a successful team. So do you carry and you use a lot of sports metaphors with your clients now?
I'm sure I do, and they probably just come on naturally. And I'm not thinking of one in particular right now, but yes, and a lot of my clients been involved in sports. In fact, my most recent client, the reason that she hired me was because of the fact that she was for a brief period of time a high school volleyball coach. And she saw that I had coached high school volleyball and at a really high level, and so she said, I think I'll hire this guy. And it's been great. And we talk about sports and the importance of development of the character piece and whatnot. So yeah. So sometimes, yeah, it helps me in gaining clients.
There you go. It's amazing how the background of all that you have done can come into effect in this kind of sphere as a coach. I see it in what I do in terms of my communication
Yeah, yeah.
background, my journalism background. I've had that impact as well.
Hmm. Yeah, truly. And I feel like my career was really preparing me for my vocation. So, in other words, all those years that I spent, coaching junior high and high school kids, even elementary kids, from that standpoint, because I used to coach club volleyball as well. I feel like all those
Mm,
experiences, the relationship building, the problem solving, and a lot of that had to do with parents who had their own agendas around different things, and so. No, I learned so much. I mean, it was invaluable to me, in terms of who I am and what I'm doing now.
beautiful. Um, so let's shift over into what you're doing now and leave
Hmm.
that part behind. Um, so you deal with executive level people mostly, I'm assuming, people in high positions,
Yes, yeah, or
and
mid
whether
level.
they be in
Yeah, yep,
companies, government, what have you, in their
right,
careers.
correct.
What do you see as the most common barrier that holds people back or that they come to you for?
I think, well, a couple of things. Number one, because you and I think, talked about this in our pre-discussion around people gaining access to their emotions. They don't really know what they're feeling, and they also know, though, that emotions play a huge role in how they lead, the way that they lead. And so I think that yeah, that people gaining access to emotions, but two of the things that well, I guess I would say the number one thing that when people come to me, that somehow, some way, it always comes to the forefront rather quickly, that leaders, they've never learned how to process loss. Okay, they've never learned how to grieve well. And there is a process for that, rather than just, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, cowboy up, carry
Right.
on,
Yeah.
forget about it. There's a better way. There's a better way. And
What do you
so,
mean by grieving for someone in a career position versus a
okay,
personal loss?
okay, yeah, well, all of it. Loss is loss, from my standpoint. I think that, what most leaders have been taught to do or just naturally do, because, like I said, none of this, we don't, well, one of my therapist friends, she once said that we don't have a grief fluency in our country. I thought,
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And so, therefore, when it comes to loss, most people, what they will do is they'll isolate. And as I've learned from one of my thought leaders, Dr. John Townsend, he said years ago to me, I've never forgotten it, that grief that's brought to community is cut in half, and grief that's spent in isolation is doubled. And also, unresolved grief is buried alive. I don't know. My best picture I can think of that. I've never been a zombie movie guy, but I get this picture of a hand reaching up through the ground and grabbing onto someone's leg and holding onto it and won't let go.
That's the
And
buried grief.
yeah, and so to me, that's unresolved grief. And so therefore, to have someone that can, lead them through the process, be in community with them, help them to value what is no more, and then to be able to be sad and say goodbye. And then there's the forgiveness piece as well. Then we can start to search for the replacement piece for that which has been lost, because we don't learn or adapt until those steps have been on some level mastered, if you will. And because otherwise there'll still be remnants of the grief just kind of hanging around.
And how do you go about doing that sort of thing? How do you lead someone through that process? Say it's a corporate leader who's who's grieving the loss of, say, $1 million from a project that went bust.
Yeah. Okay.
What's the
Well,
process look like? Maybe take me through some example that
sure.
you've been through,
Sure.
anonymized,
Okay.
of course.
Yeah, and I think that as coaches, we're really billed as professional listeners. So
Mm.
what I'm really listening for is the emotion in their voice around the loss, and it could be, "Wow, I'm just hearing you really beat yourself up over this whole thing," and I don't know. I need for you to hear from someone, and particularly for me, I'm not happy that you experienced that loss, but I don't think any differently of you. It's been said that our greatest relational need is acceptance. Okay, that regardless if we screw up or whatever, that we're still okay in someone else's eyes, and that's really hard, to be able to internalize, if you will. And when we think about acceptance, people talk about self acceptance all the time, but when it comes to relational needs, I think there are 6 critical ones around loss. And so acceptance would be at the top. And then containment. Okay. Where do people go, who experience painful losses and they just want to let off a ton of F bombs, and have that contained with no judgment? Man, I'm
Yeah.
really good at that. I love that part, and also who can validate their feelings. That doesn't mean that you agree. Validation never means agreement, but yeah, I get why you feel the way you do. I see why you think the way you do. And sometimes, if there's opportunity, maybe have an identification piece there.
Mhm.
And oftentimes, when it comes to personal loss, Jay, maybe the need is attunement. Okay, just kind of jumping in the well with someone. I think it was Brene Brown who kind of coined that phrase. Being
Mhm.
in the well. I want to make sure I give credit where credit's due, but then also, but everything in that group of needs I just talked about really boils down to comfort. The idea that there's loss there, and somebody needs somebody that's just, a traveling partner with them in the midst of that loss.
Mm. I think and it brings me back to something. I lost my father when I was young. And one of the most helpful things was I took a trip. I needed to get out of here. I needed to go to Spain. So I went to Spain. And on that trip, I met somebody and he said, thing that changed it for me, it's always going to suck. It's always going to suck. There's no getting over this. It's always going to suck. And that,
Mhm.
for some reason, lifted a weight off my shoulders.
Yeah,
Huge weight.
absolutely. And the only thing I wonder about, though, is that instead of getting over this, and I'm with you. I don't think that we necessarily get over painful losses like that, but I
No.
do believe that we get through painful losses like that going back to, like, for instance, what I mentioned around step 2 in the grieving process, value what is no more. So in other words, being able to cherish those memories, all the good things, because it wasn't
Yeah.
all bad, even if, the person you lost, you had more, I don't know, difficult challenges to navigate than otherwise. And but then the next step, that being sad and saying goodbye. Yeah, at some point we do. We just have to say goodbye, and but that's not an event. That's a process. The whole grieving thing is a process. It's not an event. This is not something you do in one day. In fact, David Kessler, one of the famous grief, specialists in our country, he said that when it comes particularly to traumatic losses like what you experienced, he said 2 years is first grief. And then you'll still have grief waves after that, but they all become fewer and farther between.
That's what the guy in Spain told me. He said it's the space in between those waves just gets longer and longer. Every now and
Yeah.
again, pow, you'll get hit by a wave and it'll hurt. You'll feel that original shock. It gets a
Yeah.
little bit easier every single time.
Yeah. But the question is, what do you do with that wave so you don't get pulled under and carried back out to sea? Okay. And that's why it's so
Hmm.
important to bring those grief waves to community. Bring those grief
Community.
waves to community. You're safe people in your world. And particularly people who get grief, people who've been there and can, on some level, can identify with your loss.
Yeah, I think I've seen that happen to a bunch of friends who lost and then got lost themselves and were taken by the waves, so to
Yeah.
speak. And that was hard to watch, especially
Yeah.
after what I went through and how I had to deal with that and doing my own version of
Right.
kind of what you're saying to some degree.
Yeah.
It was interesting to
Well,
watch.
you reminded me of, yeah, you remind me, yeah, you remind me of something a term I'd never heard before, but reading a book, in fact, that was suggested by one of your previous guests, Scott Livingston, Next by Joanne Lipman. And she just talked about the fact that there, is more evidence to support post trauma recovery so that there are
Mhm.
people who are able to navigate trauma rather than being stuck in it. Okay. And really, this kind of goes back to the beginning when you're sort of asking me about this grief piece. And yeah, I think one of the things that I do, well, first of all, I'm not afraid to go there with loss.
Mhm.
And then secondly, I'm not afraid to jump in the quicksand with them or provide something to pull them out, you know? And so, anyway, I guess that's not a good illustration of jumping in the quicksand with them, but to offer a
Yeah,
rope
don't get in
to
there.
pull them out. Yeah,
Don't.
that'd probably be a better way to say it.
Yeah, don't jump in there with them.
Yeah.
So thank you. That's great. That's fantastic. I want to switch gears. Talk about legacy. That's
Mhm.
all over your website. Legacy is a big part of what you talk about. What does the term legacy mean to you, and what does it mean to some of your clients?
Yeah. 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 Legacy was something that was consuming me over the last part of my teaching and coaching career. And I learned at that point that there was a difference between legacy and inheritance. Inheritance is leaving something to someone, legacy is leaving something in someone. And so to me, legacy equals impact. Okay, influence might be more related to inheritance. I don't think that influence is a bad thing, but when I think of legacy, I'm thinking about the capacity to be able to go a mile deep. Maybe you're an inch wide, as opposed to the other way around. And
Mhm.
but I don't know. Kouzes and Posner in their book on legacy, they talk about it, being leaving the campsite better than you found it. I think it was Steve Jobs that said that leaving your dent in the universe. And the men's group I was part of just recently, in fact, last week, we were talking about this very thing. and how the fact that we're just all going to be forgotten about. And I said, I get that, but I don't know if I completely buy into it, because I can think of a couple of influencers in my life, or legacy people, I will call them, that I will never forget some of the things that they said at the right season of time that just moved me to a different space from where I was.
Yeah.
And
And that
that's
you can
that's it.
implant that into somebody else, right? And
Hmm.
that idea, and then you can pass that on. And that is the legacy that you leave behind.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I love
Yeah.
that. That's beautiful.
Yeah. And so that's who I am, and that is my identity. And in fact, as close as I can tell, the two words that describe my identity: legacy builder. Legacy
Legacy
builder.
builder.
Yeah.
Mm. I love that idea. I love that idea because a lot of people, probably a lot of problems in the world are caused by a lot of people trying to leave a weird legacy behind and not leave a right one behind. You can see in
Yeah.
what's going on in the world today. There's a lot of problems with legacy. I think a lot of people trying to leave a mark, but leaving it in the wrong way.
I think you're right. And that'll draw us back into what we were talking about earlier. And I think that part of that is people really experiencing someone who resonates with them, and particularly with loss. And so, again, I'll just go back to what we call in my world quadrant one needs, all those things
Mhm.
around comfort, acceptance, containment, validation, identification, attunement, and comfort. And I believe that those are the people who can go there. Those are the ones that are leaving a legacy, because the fact they took the time, to be there, not to do something, or to offer up some, piece of advice or whatever, although from time to time that can be helpful. But really, what people want most of the time is for somebody just to be present with them in their experience right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I have kids. I see that every single day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so you have a belief I read on the through the website and through research that everybody is a leader.
Hmm.
And I know a lot of people out there listening, maybe sitting in an office right now and looking at their boss and might go, no, not everybody is a leader. What does that mean to you? And what do you mean by everybody is a leader?
Okay. I think that everybody has been built with the capacity to lead. And I agree with what you're saying. Not everybody is a leader, but that's because of the fact they haven't invested in their leadership development. You probably heard my friend Scott Livingston say that, if you're coaching or leading anybody and not being coached and led yourself, you are guilty of malpractice. And so I do think that there's a lot of malpractice out there, because of the fact that people, I know they're trying to do it on their own. And we all need people. I mean, we're all the heroes of our own story, but we need the people who can coach us ourselves, who can walk with us throughout the journey. I'm a firm believer, and I eat my own cooking, so to speak, in that, maybe it's just because I'm so needy that I have to have three coaches in my world. I need a business coach, I need a trauma informed coach, because there's so much, trauma processing going on out there. And a third guy, he doesn't know what to call himself in my life, but I just brings input. So he just calls me my spiritual director. And so, but all three of them bring something in me. They're part of my input, so that boom, that gets spread out to everybody else. And they become a part of my legacy, which helps me to, build a new trajectory for the legacy journey for others.
One of the things that I saw that kind of changed my direction thinking for what I wanted to do with my coaching versus accent coaching is one part of it. But oftentimes when I get someone who say, hey, I'm ashamed of my accent, I don't like it, I want a better career, they often I start to peel things apart, and then I see there's a lack of confidence there. Because if you're in an area and you don't speak the language, or you are the other, they feel lower. And so their voices are a mirror to that feeling, and their voices drop, their confidence drops. And so one of the
Hmm.
videos that I watched was Everybody Needs a Coach. That was Bill Gates, I think, did a speech on TED Talk. Everybody needs a coach. And that was a interesting way to look at it, that even the people at the top, or you perceive to be at the top, are still those needing that sort of thing. Everybody needs a coach. That was an interesting one for me.
Yeah. Or in my case, coaches, as in
Coaches,
plural.
coaches.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
geez, I got to go get myself a couple of coaches to start leveling up.
Yes, exactly. And so yeah, I want to be at the top of my game so I can help everybody else get there. I was thinking of another little, we're joking around about little adages, and one of my favorite things too is to say that I want to help you to, I want your old ceiling to become your new floor. And so, and each time we're together, we're seeking to stretch toward that new ceiling, and we're not going back to the basement, so to speak. And so,
I love that.
anyway, yeah, that was another thing you made me think of.
I love those little bits of wisdom. Cowboy Up was one of my favorites. I learned a long time ago. I'm not from
Yeah,
Montana, so I never heard that one growing up. Cowboy Up. I love that one. Even though I watched
yeah,
a lot of westerns growing up, I had never heard that one. I'd never heard
yes.
that one. Um, so we live in a very topsy turvy world these days. What are some of the, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, generationally speaking? I heard an interesting one. And this one goes back to the grief question. So I'm trying to get off that one, but there was one instance I saw on, it was another podcast where this lady made the claim that the millennials and up, so Gen Z, millennials, and Gen Alpha, all of those are going to have a hell of a time dealing with loss, because previous generations were left to their own devices and allowed to go out and roam the world freely, like I was when I was growing up. I'm sure like you were when you were growing up, that their parents weren't so involved in their lives every day. One of the podcasters said, I don't even pay my bills. My mom has to call me to pay my bills. I don't know how I'm going to lose this woman. Do you see any sort of generational differences with the people that you're dealing with? Because I deal with people who as young as 15 to as old as 65.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I think you've kind of drifted us into the dreaded drama triangle versus the problem solving triangle. Okay.
Okay.
And so when we think about, yeah, that, and I think it has been, maybe just, well, first of all, let's go to entitlement first. People complaining about entitlement, and they say, oh, yeah, that kid's entitled and this and that and the other thing. Well, for entitlement to exist, there has to be an entitler. And so, therefore, I don't know, there's some people who they relish the role of rescuer, or maybe just being codependent, whatever you want to say. And so they leave their child in a victim stance, or a learned helplessness stance, if you will. And then everything that happens to them in the world then becomes a persecutor, right? As opposed to when we help them to shift into the problem solving triangle. Hey, instead of being a victim, I wonder what it would look like to be a survivor slash thriver, and this is where you could even tie into trauma recovery piece. And then we start to see things as a challenge, or a problem to overcome. And then with someone else, we begin to co-create, something new, like with a coach, but you become your own coach, so to speak, because at the end of the day, I don't care, what, you know, Gen Z, Gen X, whatever that you are. I think there are some basics to our human existence, like the development of, personal responsibility, personal agency. Okay. Where, you know what, I may not be totally control of everything, but I am in charge. I am in charge. I have some choices that I get to make. And as Scott probably shared with you, there's a decision making composite, in the emotional intelligence assessment. And so, and by the way, that seems to be along with self-perception, particularly self-regard, this decision-making composite. I think that it doesn't matter who you are, you're going to be making decisions all your life.
Hmm.
And the question is, how will you make those decisions? And do you have that personal inner strength to be able to make decisions, especially when emotions are involved?
Mm.
You
Amen to
know?
that. Amen to that.
But sadly, I'll just say one last thing to that. Sorry. You
Sure.
know, there's another subcomponent of that, which is reality testing. And because of the fact, and that's what, some of these parents have done, is they have not allowed their kids to experience reality, you know, to get bumped and pushed down and beat up a little bit. But then instead of swinging in the hammock of sympathy, they put them on the trampoline of resilience.
Yeah. That's probably the biggest factor for me is the reality piece that a lot of the new generations are not involved in very much. Excuse me. And I see that with my kids and I try to push them towards that piece, but it's really difficult in this time when there aren't other co-creators out there wanting to be part of that reality and then push them even further. You have one kid and another kid will push that other kid towards that reality in the community, as you said
Yeah,
earlier. And so that is, I think, probably the biggest challenge for a lot of kids.
yeah. I would think too that that third subcomposite of decision making is impulse control. Man, a lot of really low impulse control instead of you know um, pay now and play later. It's the other way around, right? Okay, they don't have the capacity to what would I say? Wait, wait for later, so to speak.
Yeah. I did the marshmallow test with my kids when they were younger. Here's one marshmallow, and you'll get another one in a minute, but don't eat that one. Come
Impulse
back, and the
control.
marshmallow's always
Yeah,
gone. I
impulse control right there for sure.
wonder how I would have done
Me too.
back in 1980. Yeah. That's funny. Okay. So I want to move on. So you read a lot of books.
Mhm.
I get that from all the references you've been saying from a lot of reading. What is, just curious, what is something that you're reading that is not typical of, reading a doctor writing about psychology or something like that? What is a book for you that is out of the ordinary and that you've read recently?
Well, I'd suppose for me in my worldview, the book I read every day is the Bible, and I read it through every year, and also I see things through a different lens. I also read a devotional from Oswald Chambers. Been reading for 48 years. My utmost for his highest. It just gives me, just a different perspective. But I suppose in terms of other literature that I read, I would love to be able to say that I read from a lot of different genres and whatnot, but I don't read a lot of fiction. I mean, I'm all about leadership books and also stories and things like that. And so anyway, most of the books I read have to do with the development of better relationships, better development with your relationship with yourself, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, but I'm a leadership junkie. There's no question about that.
I've gotten away from reading. I used to read a lot of fiction. I got away from that in my later years after starting to read more nonfiction books and really getting into a lot of that stuff.
Hmm.
But I'm trying to get back into fiction because I heard somebody say, don't discount fiction because it teaches you all the stuff that you read in those nonfiction books through story. And humans love story so much. And I've been trying to get back into it and trying to discover those sorts of things. It's hard for me, as it
Yeah,
probably would be hard for you as well to leave
I
that brain party behind.
I can't even imagine what that challenge would look like, and because I'm thinking of I mean, I loved all the Clancy novels. I read every single one of those, the big ones, the 500 pagers. And now, if I'm going to
Yeah.
read a 500-page book, it's going to be from Catherine Stanley on Widen the Window, Your Window of Tolerance, or Gabor Mate on the Myth of Normal. Those are the types of books that I read that do talk about human experience, and all of those books do have specific examples of people and going through difficult things. And so I feel like that's where I need to spend my time, because if I'm a professional nudger, so to speak, helping people to get unstuck, then yeah, the more I feel that I know about where people are getting stuck, and how they got stuck there in the first place. I think the better my coaching is going to be.
So take me through. So can you take me through a process? Think of maybe one person in particular that was. I have a couple that I can name right now off the top of my head about clients that really affected me personally and my coaching career, whether it's the accent or my burgeoning, developing coaching, executive coaching career. Can you take me through an example of one of those people and why it impacted you so much? I'm sure you have a couple that you can name off the top of your head of somebody who really impacted you.
Yeah, from a client standpoint,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I can think of a couple of current clients that I have that I deal with a really strong leader of a company, in the southern part of our country. And what I really love about him is that, boy, he was a person that when we started, I've been coaching with him for about 5 years now. And when we started, I mean, he was always really good at the hard skills. And we'll just go back to, again, those 3 C's of leadership: competence, character, and connection. And he was as competent as you possibly could be. But when it came to connecting, with his workers, that was really hard, but he really worked at developing better self-awareness first, in terms of the way that he showed up, with his people, and started self-managing differently. And then I started to develop a higher level of empathy, and so therefore became more other aware and started managing relationships better. And so when you're asking about how has that impacted me, well, I get to, because of the success that he's had, he's hired me to coach other people within his company. And what's fun for me is just to see how his leadership has had an incredible impact. I mean, I'll just go back to legacy builder. His legacy to me now is completely different. I mean, he was leaving something to people in terms of information, or this is where we're going, this is how we're going to get there. But, it was one of those things where, that he was leading maybe so far ahead of people they couldn't keep up. But now he's slowed down enough to be able to help people to walk through. And I love the way he describes it. He said, I always wanted a summit. That was one of his big deals, to become a CEO/president of the company. He's achieved that. And he got there and he said, this has been kind of great, but what I really want to do now is I want to help others to summit. And that's exactly what he's doing with his executive team, helping them to summit by providing them resources to get coaching, but also just in terms of the way he interacts with those people. I don't know, that impacts me, because that tells me that leadership does matter.
Hmm.
Okay. So, and prior to him, being involved with coaching, and then he also was involved in Townsend Leadership Program for a couple of years. But, that proved to me the value of having support. He
Hmm.
always had the structure, which is one of the two things we have to have if we're going to thrive in life, but he didn't necessarily have the support. And that's what he was not. He didn't receive that. And so it wasn't necessarily providing that for the people around him, but he's gone to a whole other level in terms of the support that he provides now. So that would be one example. And that was a long one, but
No, it was a good one. It was a good one. It shows the fact that, you know, your influence or your legacy you leave in him has affected so many other people, and it's this lovely domino effect, and that is a lasting thing that probably drives you to continue and to want to do this even more. And I've had that similar feeling myself, and it's a drug that I love, because
yes.
when I see that impact on the face of my kids or on the face of a client
Hmm.
who is, I've had, from accent coaching, I've had people in tears on my calls because they now can walk into a meeting and open their mouth and feel very confident. And their accent
Hmm.
hasn't changed much. It's their confidence that has developed. And that, for me,
Right.
is one of the biggest impacts. I've been given the gift of gab, so I need to use it for these wonderful things. And it's a sacred space that people like you and I hold with our clients. And I think that's the most important thing in the world.
Yes. I couldn't agree more. And yes, I totally identify with the gift of gab. I'm full of coaching adages from my old days and the new days. And yeah, a lot of my clients will just say, "Huh, what's a new Jeffism for today?"
Jeff is there you go.
And I say, "Well, most of them are all borrowed, but in light of what we're experiencing right now, let's keep it in context, and I'll bring up something." So anyway,
So
yeah.
if you had 5 minutes with somebody and they were struggling and you only had 5 minutes, what is an immediate action or something you would say that they could start now that would leave or help them build towards a purposeful existence or a purposeful
Hmm.
life?
Okay, I'm just going to go with the first thing that comes to mind and really comes into my heart. And I was talking with my wife before we got started about this, and I said, one of the questions Jay's going to ask is some of these, you know, um, scenarios I've had where I've walked with somebody through grief, and first thing you started with somebody who's struggling. One of my former players had a little brother who died of a drug overdose, and this happened a couple of years ago. And golly, I was struggling with, wow, is this my place to drive there? And I just felt nudged. I needed to drive to their home, and I did. Sat at the bottom of the driveway and got out of the car, and then I just stood. And then there was this disheveled woman on the stairway, and she just said, "Jeff." And I just said, "Kim, is that you?" And she goes, "Yeah. Would you please, please, please come in and talk to Larry?" I mean, that was the dad, and Kim was a mom. I mean, they were just struggling big time with the loss of their son. And so the reason I'm bringing up this example, Jay, is because of the fact that I did go into the house, went to the back porch. Larry was there. He did stand up. "Hi, Jeff." I said, "Hi, Larry." And he just said, "Sit down." And I did. We didn't speak for 30 minutes. We didn't speak for 30 minutes. Didn't say a word. I didn't say a word. And so, and I guess the point that I'm making is that it's not always words that we might start with, in terms of somebody who's in struggle, but if I was going to ask something, I would say, "Well, tell me about yourself," and give me an example of something in your experience that that's going on right now that seems to be a real challenge for you, and it's got you stuck. Say more. And I'm always using that little phraseology, say more, because I do. I'm curious. I want to know more. Dan Siegel
Yeah.
taught us to always bring our bag of coal, okay? Our curiosity,
Mhm.
our openness, our acceptance, and our love. And so I seek to bring my coal to every conversation. So it always starts with curiosity. Tell me more. Or in the case of like Larry, took him 30 minutes to get there. And then, I mean, it was just, grief vomit
Yep.
all over everywhere, So I don't know. And I apologize. I took up a little bit of space with that response, but, I words are important, as you know.
Mhm.
However, sometimes just being present with somebody who is in the midst of a struggle, that might make the biggest impact, which it did with him.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a powerful moment. I thank you for sharing. That's whether in happiness or in grief too. Presence is oftentimes the most powerful thing you can do for somebody.
I can't believe you that. Thank you for reminding me of that, because along with leaders, I think there are two major struggles that they have. Number one, they don't process their losses very well because they haven't been taught. And secondly, they don't celebrate well. Jay, I'm sure you found that in your coaching as well. They don't know how to take the time to pop the cork, because of the fact they're
Yep.
always moving on to the next thing,
Yep.
always thinking
That's a big
about
one.
what's next as opposed to taking the time to just celebrate. That was my experience as a high school coach. I mean, we'd won a state championship. I was happy with my kids and everything else, but within less than 30 minutes, how are we going to do this again next year? Who's going to be our
Yep.
starting center? Who's going to be our starting outside, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, so anyway, we need to pause. We need to pause to celebrate.
That makes sense. We're having a little internet stuff happening here. But Jeff Carroll, I thank you for being here today on the Accent On podcast.
Thank
Would you like any final words?
We all need a coach. We all need a coach. Don't be guilty of malpractice. Don't be guilty of malpractice. I'll take that as a Scottism. And so that's something I truly take to heart. And then when he told me that, I was really glad at the time that, I had three coaches then when he said that. And I thought,
Yeah.
I'm good. I'm good.
I'm going to go call a coach now.
Yes, I'm not guilty of malpractice in any way, shape, or form. So, but thank you so much, Jay, for this opportunity. This was a lot of fun. I always love talking about coaching, especially around grief.
Thank you so much for being here, Jeff Carroll, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.
I hope so. Thank you.